Also, I'm feeling quite a rather young man. I must admit I was already present at the first SEMRAX session, so apparently it was a few years ago. I came several times since, but it is the first time I am responsible for a research project I will talk very little bit about. So my talk this afternoon will focus on some sense a solution of one of the problems that have been evocated in the presentation of last week, is how to design efficient iterative parallel solvers. And so in some sense, domain decomposition are iterative solvers. And with approach based on multiple search directions, I will show you that we can build efficient parallel solvers with these ideas. Okay, so first, just to explain what is the context that we want to use parallel architecture. And as you know, parallel architecture, scientific computers now are more and more parallel, with more and more compute nodes and with more and more cores inside the compute nodes, eventually with accelerators. But nevertheless, at the compute node level, you have some kind of memory hierarchy, so shared memory with multi-level cache systems. And so you don't, to be efficient, you don't only need to be parallelizable in terms of dependency, you need to have data, space, and time locality. And this is the real issue with efficient parallelization, is how can you divide. Can you design algorithm in which most of the computation will be spent on local data, small enough to fit in the cache, and reused as many times as possible in order to get the best possible performance for the single cores at the lowest level of the architecture. Okay, so at the level of the local compute node, I don't think there is a methodology that will be able to provide a single level parallelism able to scale up to hundreds of thousands of processors. So we need multi-level parallelization. So at the local level, parallelization can be based on BLAS routines, linear algebra, direct solvers, direct solvers. At a coarser level, the parallelism can be based on domain decomposition methods that is easy to implement using a message passing environment. And at an even coarser level, parallelism can be based on parallel in time approaches, coupled with parallel in space, or quasi-static nonlinear iteration. And this is the objective of the PanLIM project, on which Mustafa Gaja and Olga we'll work during this session. Okay, now first, let's start from the very lower level. So I mean at the compute node level, using direct solvers. With the help of Total Grant, we have developed at LGLL a sparse library of sparse solver based on nested bisection, using a pthread for the multithreading management, and get quite good performances. This is comparison between the dissection and the solver, the sparse solver that is provided with Intel MKL libraries. It's called Paradiso. But using the parallelism between blocks and the parallelism inside the blocks, based on decomposition in subblocks and so on and so forth, we can get quite good performances because most of the operations at the lower level are basically BLAS3 operations. It's matrix vector product on small blocks, and that can be very efficiently implemented on the local SMP multiprocessors with a hierarchy of cache memories. It's another question with the solution itself by backward-forward substitution. Because when you perform a forward-backward substitution, each data of the matrix is used only for a couple of plus and multiply, add and multiply operations. So you need a lot of, so also in theory, in terms of dependency, you can get the same parallelism in the forward-backward substitution phase as in the factorization phase based on blocks. The problem is that in the forward-backward substitution phase, you just perform BLAST2, so matrix vector product. So it means that you need a number of data that is the same amount of the number of operations that are performed, so no locality in time, and so no performance. On the opposite, if you solve several problems at the same time, so perform simultaneous forward-backward substitution with the same matrix but with multiple right-hand side, then you increase the ratio of number of operations per number of data in a linear way with the number of right-hand sides. So this is an instance. This results here show the performance of dissection on Paradiso on a 12 cores compute node with either one right-hand side or 12 right-hand side. And you can see that sometimes you can have super linear efficiency. Okay, this is, I don't know exactly why, but nevertheless, this is the point. So when you use the domain decomposition method, you could say, okay, I cannot have parallel performance for my single forward-backward substitution inside each subdomain. So I will allocate one core per subdomain. But this is not a good idea because it means that you will have several subdomains on the compute node, and each of the subdomains will try to perform its forward-backward substitution using its local matrix at the same time. And so you increase the stress on the global memory, and so it doesn't work at all, in fact. Same thing with the other kind of operation you perform is reverse organization of vectors. You use Krylov space method, so you build search direction, and you orthogonalize for the dot product associated to the matrix or to A star times A if A is not symmetric or is not positive definite. And so the other kind of operations are computation of dot products and updates of vectors, basically based on some kind of a Gram-Schmidt orthogonalization. And so this table just shows a small experiment with local vectors of dimension 50,000. So it's supposed to be the size of the interface for a subdomain at the local level. And I want to compute, to reverse orthogonalize 20 vectors against 80 vectors that have been computed at the previous iterations, using either the standard Gram-Schmidt, modified Gram-Schmidt procedure, because to get a good accuracy, you very often have to use the so-called modifying Gram-Schmidt operation. It means you orthogonalize against the first vector, update the vector, and then orthogonalize against the second, and so on and so forth. So you just perform. So when you use modifying Gram-Schmidt procedure, it means that you perform the dot product one by one, and each time you have performed the dot product, you use the result to modify the vector and then restart with a new dot product and so on and so forth. So basically, when it is modif Gram-Schmidt, it means dot products are performed one by one. When it is called simultaneous Gram-Schmidt, it means all the dot products are performed at once. And when it is called modified block Gram-Schmidt, it means that the dot products are performed by blocks. So in this column, it is 20 against 80. And in the last column, it is 20 against 20 4 times, because there is 4 blocks. What is the underlying idea? Is that when you perform your dot products on blocks of vector, it's not dot product anymore. It is matrix vector product. It's not BLAST1, it is BLAST3. So it is faster. It is faster because it is much better for the cache management. So in the first show, you have the performance measured in terms of gigaflops. You don't care about which processor it is. I mean, it is a typical situation. And with one thread on one multiple core node. So if you try to, if you say, okay, I have MPI processes, and each of the MPI process will perform its own dot products and so on, so on in parallel. So it is the case for the second row. It is 12 MPI processes, and each of the MPI process perform its own reverse organization procedure with its own set of vectors. And you see that the performance degrades a lot with the BLAS 1 because of the problem of memory access conflict. When it is BLAS 3, the performance is a little bit less, but nevertheless, I mean, the degradation is much less. And so on and so forth, up to the last case. In the last row, you have 6 nodes per MPI process. So there is parallelization inside the matrix product, plus data exchange through MPI, because the dot products are just a contribution of one process to the dot products, and so you must assemble them through MPI or reduced communication. And this is and so there is 6 cores per subdomain and 16 subdomain, and so the speed is in each subdomain is 0.8 with 1 by 1 reverse organization, and it is something like 30 times more with block reverse organization. So the same as for the forward-backward substitution, all this arithmetic, all this algebra operation can be performed much better as well as in terms of performance on the multi-core system and of performance at the global level due to message passing time reduction using block approaches. Okay, so this is the leading idea of the method I will present you today. And also one last point: when we use domain decomposition method, or at least the kind of domain decomposition method I use, we use direct local solver in subdomain. So subdomain are 3D. Let's say in the case of a simple shape subdomain that is that is a regular grid, n by n by n with degree 1 finite element or finite volume method and the d degree of freedom per node. The number of degrees of freedom per subdomain is d times n power of 3. And the number of interface degree of freedom, so the dimension of the problem on which you perform the iterative method, is 6 times d times n2. And this is the complexity of a dot product when you perform orthogonalization of a search direction vector for the domain decomposition method. With the best sparse direct solver, the fill-in of the matrix is of order d square n4. So if you compare what is the cost for one forward-backward substitution and what is the cost for one dot product with one search direction vector on the interface, as well in terms of memory requirement and of arithmetic complexity, the ratio is d2 n square compared to 6 times d n2. So it is very, very, very large. So it means that storing many directions on the interface and using them to perform full orthogonalization Krylov space method is not expensive in this context, because the evaluation of the matrix vector product for the domain decomposition operator that requires the solution of the local 3-dimensional problem takes a lot of time and operation. Okay, so let's talk now about the domain decomposition method, non-overlapping domain decomposition methods. But I will just first just start with a slide about Schur complement. Okay, so if you have a problem with a discretization based on finite difference, this is finite elements and so forth, and split between interface degree of freedom and boundary degree of freedom, you have the stiffness matrix with the block structure KII, KIB, KBI. I is for inner, B is for boundary. So when you solve the Dirichlet problem, you impose a value of x on the boundary of xb. And you solve the problem KII xi is bi minus KIB xb. And so when you solve the problem, the solution xi you find is minus KII minus 1 KIB and so on and so forth. Of course, you don't have to compute KII minus 1. You just solve the problem using a direct solver, for instance, for KII. And then you can compute what is the Neumann problem that has the same solution as the previous Dirichlet problem. Just compute the matrix vector product with a full stiffness matrix times times xi and xb. And you end up with, of course, kii xi plus kib xb is bi, because it is a problem you have solved at the inner equation level. And on the boundary, you have kbb xb, kbi xi plus kbb xb. And you replace xi by the value given by the last equation according to xb. And you find that, in fact, the Neumann, the thing that appear like the Neumann boundary condition of the problem is the product of the Shor complement times xb, that is the Dirichlet boundary condition of the interface. So the product by the Shor complement, in fact, is a discrete Dirichlet to Neumann operator on the domain. But of course, you never compute explicitly the Shor complement. You solve the Dirichlet problem and then compute the matrix vector product. And reversely, you can compute the product by the inverse of the Shor complement, because if you solve the local problem and extract the value in the interface, you make the opposite operation. So in fact, you compute the product by the inverse of the Shor complement without, of course, computing the Shor complement. Okay, so now you take your global problem, split, let's say in this case, in two subdomains. So an element-based decomposition. And so the global matrix has the standard arrow-shaped I presented here, where 1 and 2 has 4 inner nodes in domain 1 and inner nodes in domain 2, respectively, and 3 are the interface nodes and degrees of freedom. And so in each subdomain, you can compute the local stiffness matrix, the local right-hand side, and so on and so forth. And the global K33 block is the sum of contribution of domain 1 and domain 2. But what you see is that the first rows of the, okay, I'm stopping. So you had a presentation by Frédéric Natta for domain decomposition method last week, but which was based on the analysis. I will make all my presentation based on linear algebra, but of course, both say the same thing. So you see that the first rows of the global system, in fact, are either the first row of system in domain of the system in domain 1 or system in domain 2. It means that the inner equations within each subdomain can be solved locally. But if you find fields x1, x2, x3 that satisfy the inner equations, are these fields the trace of the solution of the global problem? This is the point. No, not necessarily. There are interface matching conditions. The first condition is an admissibility condition. Because x31 and x32 in domain 1 and domain 2 must be the trace of the solution of the global problem x3. That is unique, of course. So x31 must be equal to x32. This is an admissibility condition. But it's not enough. It is not enough. Even if x31 is equal to x32, you just have the two first rows of the global system when you solve the local problem. And you are missing the last row, the one that is associated with the interface unknowns. And this is, in fact, an equilibrium condition. And this equilibrium condition can be rewritten using the decomposition in two of the matrix and the vectors, as in the last row there. So these are the two conditions that the solution of the local problem must satisfy in order to be the solution of the global problem. So the so-called Shor complement method consists in saying, okay, I will take as interface unknown the trace of the solutions on the interface. So I will take x3 as my unknown. So x3 of 1 and x3 of 2 will be equal to x3. So now in each subdomain, I can solve the local Dirichlet problem because I know x3. And is the solution of the local problem the solution of the global problem? Not necessarily. The question is, does the solution of the local problem satisfy the equilibrium condition on the interface? And so we can compute the residual, and so the equilibrium condition of this interface defines the residual, and by the same change of variable I made previously for the single block, you find that in fact the interface problem associated with this method is associated with the Schur complement matrix. And this is the name, this is the reason why this method was called the Schur complement method. But when you implement that, of course, you don't compute the Schur complement. It means that you take X3 as an unknown. X3 being given, you solve the local Dirichlet problem. Once you have solved the local Dirichlet problem, you multiply the local solution by the local stiffness, complete stiffness matrix, and so you compute the residual on the interface within each subdomain, and the global residual in the interface is just the sum of global residual on left and right. And so now you have a method to compute the product by the Schur complement, and you can apply a cryospace method for solving, in fact, the condensed interface problem that is defined by the last row of these equations. Okay, but this is not the only way to do. In fact, you can enforce any kind of boundary conditions in your subdomain. Whatever you put as boundary conditions, you will always keep the same inner equations inside the subdomain, so you will still solve the inner equilibrium exactly. And so the most general boundary condition, linear boundary condition you can imagine is the Robin type boundary condition. It means that in each subdomain you have a term in the matrix for the diagonal term associated for the interface, and a right-hand side. So K1 and K2 are augmentation matrices locally, local augmentation matrices. Lambda 1 and lambda 2 are the right-hand side of the local Robin problem. And the interface matching condition to ensure that the solutions of the local problems are the solutions of the global problem are still the same. The first condition is the admissibility condition. X31 must be equal to X32. The second condition is the equilibrium condition, but the equilibrium condition, due to the local Robin condition, it can be rewritten using lambda and K. Okay, so you could apply a cryospace method to this interface problem. In fact, in this interface problem, I have apparently I have four variables that are X31, X32, lambda 1, and lambda 2, but it is not true, because X31 and X32 depends on lambda 1 and lambda 2. Lambda 1 and lambda 2 being given, X31 and X32 are computable by the solution of the local Robin problem. So in fact, the unknowns of the problem are lambda 1 and lambda 2. Okay, so I could perform some cryospace iteration on this using the initial definition of the interface matching condition as residual. But these interface matching conditions, they are mixed, in fact. Imagine if the problem you solve is the Poisson equation, it means that X is the temperature, and lambda plus Kx is homogeneous to a flux. If you are computing a linear SST problem, X is a displacement, and lambda is a force. So it is a mixed problem. And you know that mixed problems are generally not very well suited for iterative procedure due to the fact that you have two spectrums, one for the primal variables, another for the dual variables, and the global spectrum is bad. So we can combine the equations, the first two equations, to find two homogeneous conditions, and both are related to quantities that are both homogeneous to fluxes or forces and so on and so forth. And so the second formulation is a priori much better suited for parallel iteration. And this defines the condensed interface problem. And now we can compute formally what is the associated interface operator. The associated interface operator, to compute that, I mean, we need to compute what is the relationship between, we must compute explicitly what is the relationship between X31 and lambda 1 and X32 and lambda 2, and the relationship, of course, is the local Schur complement, but of the augmented matrix. I added a small k locally, so I get the small k in the local Shor complement. So from the first equation, you can write what is X3, you can write explicitly what is X31 against lambda 1, X32 against lambda 2, and replace where? Replace in these two equations there, and you find the formal representation of the problem, and the matrix of formal representation of the problem is at the bottom of the slide here. So, good news, the diagonal blocks of this matrix are identity, because we have taken an homogeneous formulation of the matching conditions and that are directly related to the interface unknown lambda 1 and lambda 2. And what do you have on the outer blocks? It is identity minus something that is small k of 1 plus small k of 2 plus a Shor complement of domain 2 plus k2 minus 1. It means that there are values of k1, small k1 and small k2 for which the diagonal blocks are 0. And then it's a direct method. And what are the value? What are the optimal interface conditions for which the diagonal entries of my interface matrix is 0? It's just if you take k1 as a Shor complement of domain 2 and k2 as a Shor complement of domain 1, then in the previous formula, you see that you have Shor complement plus Shor complement times Shor complement plus Shor complement minus 1, so identity minus identity, it is 0. But this is not a surprise, in fact. because why? Because what does the Shor complement represent? I mean, you need that within each subdomain, K1 is the augmentation matrix in domain 1. So it is the Robin boundary condition in domain 1. A Robin boundary condition, it couples the solution and its normal derivative in some sense. So it couples Dirichlet to Neumann. So when you impose locally in one subdomain a boundary condition that says that at the boundary of the subdomain, the relationship between the Dirichlet and Neumann must be the one that is controlled by the outer domain, you are solving directly the couple problem. And the same methodology can apply in many couple problems, not only on domain decomposition. And so, but algebraically, it's easy to see when you take the global problem and just eliminate unknowns of domain 2, then the resulting problem has only x1 and x3 unknowns, and you see that the block, the 3-3 block in domain 1, when you eliminate inner unknowns of domain 2, is k3 of 1 plus Shor complement of k3 of 2. It is a local condensation. So it's a direct method. If you build your pseudo or generalized Robin boundary condition based on the Shor complement of the outer problem. So it leads to well-posed local problems, even with irregular mesh splitting and so on and so forth. It converges in, let's say, p-1 iterations if the number of subdomain is p in one direction. Sorry, it's not exactly what I wanted to do. Cuckoo, come. No? Doesn't want to come. Never mind. Let's forget. But the issue is that in practice you cannot compute the optimal. I mean, you cannot compute, and even if you have it, using it is very expensive because it is a dense operator. So Dirichlet to Neumann mapping, it is a full matrix, and you don't only need the Dirichlet to Neumann matrix of the neighboring subdomain. You need the Dirichlet to Neumann mapping of all the rest of the problem. So it is impossible to compute that. It's much too expensive, of course. Or if you compute that, you just use a direct solver. No need to use this formulation. So you need an approximation of the Dirichlet to Neumann mapping. But for wave equation problem, this is a well-known problem. I mean, approximation of the Dirichlet to Neumann mapping, it is associated to the question of approximate transparent boundary conditions. So you have plenty of literature on the subject, and several, hundreds of things to build a sparse approximation of the Dirichlet to Neumann operator. So we apply that to a problem for Maxwell equations. So for Maxwell equations, in each subdomain we solve the local problem for Maxwell equation using Nedelec finite element, and we have interface boundary conditions that are the first order transparent boundary condition associated with the Maxwell equation. Okay, I will not. And we use that for solving some problems, some big problems at Onera for so-called antenna arrays. So what are antenna arrays? In fact, these devices, it is antenna for radar antenna for airplanes, for airplanes or aerospace systems that are, in some sense, two-dimensional. So it is a two-dimensional grid of very small emitting small antenna that are very, very thin. And depending upon what is the emission made by each cell of the antenna, you can build a radar beam with different properties in terms of orientation, in terms of power, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't take too much room in the plane. Of course, in an Airbus 380, it's not necessarily a big problem. On a warplane, it is already seriously packed, so avoiding to have a three-dimensional antenna is something that is quite interesting. Okay, the problem is that if you want to take, each cell of the antenna is in fact a multi-heterogeneous stuff with dielectric conducting materials with special shapes and so on and so forth. So you need a very fine mesh if you want to be able to represent correctly what is happening at each individual cell level. Some of you could say, why do you not use some kind of homogenization method for this kind of thing if the array is large enough? The problem is that this array is not supposed to be planar, in fact, because it will be stuck on the fuselage of the plane in a place that is not necessarily a plane. It is an airplane, but not a plane. And in this case, homogenization method don't work, in fact. And so this leads to problems with very huge number of degrees of freedom, and it has to be solved for multiple incident waves or multiple excitation modes, and so with many right-hand sides. So it is two things that make the solution of this problem very expensive. So what? So this is the first experiment we made with increasing number of subdomains and size of problem. So with increasing number of, with increasing size of the antenna array. So up to, I don't know, 13,000 subdomains, and I don't know how many degrees of freedom per subdomain, but with globally, the biggest case with 2 billion degrees of freedom globally. And in fact, it scales not so bad. There is a small increase in the number of iterations when you increase the number of subdomains. But in this case, it works rather well. Also, there is no coarse grid problems. But why? Because subdomains are very complex behavior. So the way that is created by one element in the array tends to be absorbed by the neighboring cells, and so this is why the method works with this very simple with the first order Robin boundary condition without any multi-grid preconditioner. Okay, but now let's go to the point with the multiple. So, but we have to solve the problem for multiple right-hand side and how to accelerate the solution of the multiple right-hand side. Okay, so the method we use for the iteration of the interface is orthodir, or it could be orthomean. The difference between orthodir and orthomean is very, very small. This method consists in building an F star F orthogonal basis of the Krylov space. So at each iteration, you perform a matrix vector product, build a new search direction vector, F star F orthogonalized against the previously computed vector, and build the optimal solution using these vectors. And since the vectors are F star F orthogonal, so like in the conjugate gradient method, at each iteration, when you build the optimal correction using the new vector, in fact, you build the optimal solution using all the vectors that have been built iteratively because of this F star F orthogonality. Okay. So it means that at each iteration, you compute new lambda p is p minus 1 plus search direction vector vp1 times optimal coefficient. And the new search direction vector vp is built by f using f times the previous vector, re-orthogonalized using a modifying Gram-Schmidt procedure against the previously computed vectors. Okay, but if you analyze after p iteration what you did, after p iteration, you build a set of p vectors, v0, v1, vp minus 1, call that capital V with an upper script p. This is a set of vectors. And the set of vector is F star F orthogonal. It means that FVP star FVP is a diagonal matrix. Okay, and the optimal solution lambda p has been built from lambda 0 plus vp times capital rho p. And capital rho p now is a vector, and the vector is a solution of fvp star fvp. Capital rho p is minus fvp star g0. Okay, so you have solved the problem for a first right-hand side, and now you start with the second right-hand side. But you already have the vps and the fvps that have been computed for the first one. So what can you do with that? You can search an optimal starting solution for the new right-hand side using the set of vectors Vp coming from the previous solution. So just apply this block, this a posteriori block orthodir or orthomin method. And so in fact, and then start the new iterations, and the new vectors you will build, they must be also F star F orthogonal to the vectors that you have used for building your initialization of your optimized initialization vector. So from one right-hand side to another, you increase the size of the basis. But in terms of implementation, it is very simple because it is just some kind of continuation. I mean, it looks like if you are just continuing your orthodir iterations. So this is an example of using this method for a 17 by 17 array, antenna array. So it is it's a bit less than 300 subdomain, 50 million unknowns. You see that at the first iteration, for the first right-hand side, the number of iterations for the interface was rather high. I mean, between 380 and 400. But for the second right-hand side, we just needed 80 extra iterations due to the initialization using the 400 previously computed search direction vectors and so on and so forth. And you see in this curve the number of extra iterations that are needed, so the number of new vectors that need to be built at each iteration in order to solve the various problems. We'll say, okay, after some time, it makes too many vectors, so I stop keeping all the previously computing vectors. That is not a good idea. You see that the number of iterations can increase a lot. So we just keep all. So the purely brute force, don't think. Just sometimes it works. Okay. And so with this problem, the elapsed time with an implementation with one core per subdomain, so in this case we are still on one core per subdomain, 15 million unknowns, for 31 right-hand side. If we had applied the method restarting the iteration for each right-hand side, the time would have been 29 seconds. We didn't compute that. I mean, you multiply by 31 the time for solving one. And the time for solving with the continued orthodir is divided by 9. So it is just numerical. There is nothing to do with parallelization here. It is the same method. It is just thanks to the continuation method. But now, we want also to improve the parallel performance, and then we use a block orthodir algorithm. So what is the idea of the block orthodir? You can perform the same kind of thing using the fact that your search direction vector do not come from previously computed right-hand side, but from a block of right-hand side. You solve at the same time, let's say 16 right-hand side at the same time. So at each iteration, you build 16 new search direction vectors. And this block of 16, you use it to optimize all the 16. So you don't just perform simultaneously 16 orthodir. We perform a block orthodir. So the 16 directions that are computed at each iteration are used for optimizing all of the 16 problems with the 16 right-hand side. We are solving at the same time. So we are doing, in some sense, simultaneously the continuation procedure with this approach. And then all the operations become, as I told you, block by block orthogonalization, so BLAS3 operations instead of BLAS1. And when you solve the local problem, of course, since there is, when you compute the product by the Feti operator, we have to solve 16 local problems at the same time, and so we can benefit of parallelization for the forward-backward substitution as well. Which okay, so this is the same problem as the previous one. It is still with one core per subdomain. And even with one core per subdomain, we divide the time by 4 using the block method instead of the one-by-one continuation method. Why? Because all the algebra operations are BLAS3 operations instead of BLAS1. So we get a better percentage of the performance of each individual core, even with a one core per subdomain implementation. And furthermore, we can also now have several cores allocated per subdomain and also have parallelization, local parallelization. So each subdomain now is allocated to, I don't know, 12 cores. So it means that the forward-backward substitution are made in parallel, and the BLAS3 operation for the localization are made also in parallel. And in this case, you see that the continued orthodir method did not improve a lot because, I mean, it depends on the right-hand side, I mean, in fact. In this case, it is the worst case because it is just a one-dimensional array. And the right-hand side consists in lighting alternatively each of the element array. So, I mean, the right-hand side are as independent as possible, and so the continuation method is much less efficient. I mean, you just divide the time by 2. But then you have the parallel efficiency. And so we get good speedups. Next method. So it's Feti, standard Feti. Standard Feti. In standard Feti, we have local Neumann problem. So lambda 1, lambda 2 are the local Neumann boundary condition, and so they still have interface admissibility condition. X31 must be equal to X32, and the interface equilibrium condition now writes lambda 1 plus lambda 2 must be equal to 0. So this is enforcing lambda 1 plus lambda 2 is equal to 0 is easy. You just say, okay, lambda 1 will be equal to minus lambda 2. This is my interface unknown, lambda. And now, lambda being given, the interface residual is X31 minus X32. And use conjugate gradient algorithm to solve this problem. Okay, we can perform exactly the same analysis. What is the relationship between X31 and lambda? It depends on the Schur complement. But now the unknowns are not X3 and the residual lambda, it is the opposite way around. The unknown is lambda and the residual is X3 minus X3. And so the matrix of Feti is the sum of the inverse of the local Schur complement. It is Neumann to Dirichlet local problem instead of Dirichlet to Neumann local problems. Okay. So Feti operator is S1 minus 1 plus S2 minus 1. How can we precondition this operator? S1 and S2 have the same are the same type of operator. You have two subdomains, the Schur complement as the interface, have the same kind of spectrum. So it makes sense to search an inverse of S1 minus 1 plus S2 minus 2 using the inverses of S1 minus 1 and S2 minus 2 that are S1 and S2. So this is the so-called optimal local Dirichlet preconditioner. So we take as a preconditioner 1/2 of S1 times S1 plus 1/2 of S2 plus S2. It means that at each iteration, we have a residual on the interface that is a jump, the discontinuity, if you are making linear elasticity, and solve the local problem associated to an imposed displacement equal to half this jump within each subdomain, compute the force, so solve the Dirichlet problem, compute the force, average the force, and this is the approximate inverse. So the approximate precondition vector. So this is a preconditioner based on Dirichlet, excuse me. Okay, but in FETIS there is something that is that at the beginning was considered as a drawback, but in practice it is an advantage of the method. Is that in fact the local Neumann problems can be ill-posed. So you have, I mean, the relationship between the local Dirichlet problem is well posed. So when you look at the right-hand side of the Neumann problem lambda and the trace of the solution of the local X-ray problem locally, the matrix that map X-ray 1 on lambda is the Schur complement. But if the local matrix K is ill-posed, it means that also the Schur complement is singular. And so you cannot solve, I mean, the equation does not give you directly the local solution. The equation tells you the solution is a product by a pseudo-inverse. So it means one admissible solution of the problem, any one, plus a correction in the kernel. And the right-hand side must be orthogonal to the kernel. So the local problem is well posed. So now if we replace this in the equations, we don't have a problem with just lambda as unknowns with S1 minus 1 plus S2 minus 2 operator, but we have a mixed problem with lambda and the alpha that are the local correction with, in the case of linear elasticity, the local rigid body modes. So the global problem on the interface is a mixed problem. So I told you, avoid mixed problem, and we have a mixed problem. So it's bad. No, it's not so bad because, in fact, the number of constraints is very small. What is the dimension of the GT transpose lambda must be equal to 0? It depends on the number of null modes in each subdomain. So if you have 100 subdomains, and if you have a 6 rigid body displacement in each subdomain, the number of constraints is 600. So it is small. So in this case, you can use a projected conjugate gradient method in order to solve the problem, because the projection can be computed. What is the projection? The projection is identity minus G, GT, G minus 1, GT. But GT, what is the dimension of GT, G? Okay, in the case I presented you, it's 600. It is a small problem. And it is a sparse matrix. GT, G, it's a sparse matrix. You have a non-zero coefficient in the GTG matrix only linking rigid body motions of neighboring subdomains. The GTG entry, it is just the dot product of the traces of the rigid body motion in each subdomain on the interface. So it is a small sparse matrix. So you can apply a projected conjugate gradient method to solve this problem. And the good point is that, in fact, when you compute the projection, what do? You compute a local correction of the local solution based on the local rigid body motions if I go on with a linear elasticity environment. And in fact, you compute the local rigid body motions that will make the global displacement field as continuous as possible at the interface. So it is exactly like a multi-grid method in which the coarser grid is just defined by the local rigid body motions of each subdomain. And it has a global coarse grid preconditioner effect that lead to a convergence that is independent upon the number of subdomains. Sometimes. I mean, in simple case where the splitting, when the splitting is clean and so on and so forth. Real life is a little bit harder. I work a lot with a company called Hutchinson, that is a subsidiary of Total, that build devices made of rubber. Rubber is a nonlinear, quasi-incompressible material. And generally in rubber, they put plastic and metal and things like that. So composite materials, strange shapes, thin structure, so on and so forth. So we have very heterogeneous finite element models, and in fact, and furthermore, the mesh splitting can create also ill conditioning if it creates a geometrically insane shape, and that sometimes happens. Okay, so the preconditioner can be already improved by using weight. Instead of making 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, we can do things a little bit more clever in order to take into account heterogeneity. Because, okay, what is the mechanical interpretation of the weighting of the preconditioner? So the interface gradient is the jump of displacement. So you have two substructures, and you have a prevision of the interaction force, that is lambda. You compute the displacement, and okay, there is a jump. The inverse problem consists in finding what is the force, the interaction force that will make the jump to vanish. If you compute this force, you have solved the inverse problem, so you have solved the problem. Okay. So now, the idea of the Dirichlet preconditioner consists to say, okay, I impose to each subdomain to make a part of the way in order to fill the gap. This is the 1/2 in the case where the domains are similar, but it could be different of 1/2. I compute the force that I need to impose in this subdomain in order to get this displacement of a fraction of the jump. And I say, okay, my left subdomain, I say the result is something is a W1. The subdomain 2, I say the result is W2, and the closest good response is something between 1/2 or D1 W1 plus D2 W2 with a weighting factor. And the idea is that, in fact, if the blue structure here is very stiff and the red is very, very smooth, you can imagine that it is not it is not the stiff one that will move in order to stick to the smooth one, but exactly the opposite way around. It means that if the blue substructure is much stiffer than the red one, then it means that the blue substructure will make only a very small fraction of the movement in order to fill the gap, and the other one will make most of the displacement, and it is much better. So it works quite well. It works quite well when heterogeneity is clean in the sense of the decomposition. It means that if you have one subdomain that is made of concrete and the other one that is made of foam, and you say the concrete you don't move, and to the foam, yes, you move to fill the gap, yes, it converges in one iteration generally. It works very well. But in real life, you can have heterogeneity not only across the interface, but also along the interface. Then it is less clear. So this is a very simple model, okay? It's some kind of composite material, so it is supposed to be a polymer matrix, the red material. It is smooth, nearly incompressible, and we have stiff fibers, and the fibers themselves are made of various materials with a Young modulus that varies from 10 to 10 to the power of 6 and something like that. Okay, and furthermore, the shape of the pseudodomain can also create anisotropy. If I split this problem in squares, the behavior of the square in each direction tends to be a little bit the same. When I split in stripes like this, it means that it is very stiff in the longitudinal direction and very smooth because it is thin if I apply shear stress. So even in a smooth, in an homogeneous material, the geometry of the splitting can create heterogeneity in some sense. In this case, what is the root? What is the right entry? It's not so easy. So this is the idea of the, and so, I mean, the local Dirichlet problem is optimal. It is the reverse operator of the local Neumann to Dirichlet problem. Where are we losing information is when we are averaging the value on the left and the value of the right. It is clear if everything is homogeneous on the left, everything is homogeneous on the right, there is a ratio, and we use this ratio in order to make the splitting, to make the weighting. But when everything is heterogeneous everywhere, what is a good ratio? Okay, and so the idea of the SVT method that was developed by Nicole Spillan and Daniel Rixen consists, okay, but we are not going to sum the contribution. We say, okay, subdomain 1 say the Dirichlet to Neumann local product gives one vector. Subdomain 2 gives another vector, and we are going to keep both vectors as search direction vectors, as independent search direction vectors. So this is in the case of two subdomains. If you have many subdomains, on each interface you split. You say, okay, there is a contribution on the left, a contribution on the right, or on the top of the bottom. I don't care. You have two contributions. And you keep each of these individual contributions as a candidate search direction vector. Okay, so in the case here in the case, if you have a 4 subdomain like presented here, with the standard FETI method, there is one vector on the interface that is obtained by solving the local Dirichlet problem and averaging on the interface. In the case of on the right, we have 6 such search directions because we have 2 on each interface coming from the solution of the local Dirichlet problem on domain 1 and domain 2. So the total number of candidate directions is 2 times the total number of interfaces. But, so it's huge, because I mean, if you have hundreds of thousands of subdomains, you will have thousands of interfaces. So thousands of candidate search direction vectors. Lots. Yes, but in fact, this set of vectors defines what we call the core space. What is a core space? A core space is something that, whose dimension depends only on the number of subdomains. So it means that you can have 1 million or 30 million degrees of freedom per subdomain. The dimension of the core space is still the same. It is 2 times the number of interfaces. And furthermore, when you look at the vector that defines the core space, we call that modes, because it looks like modes in some sense, if you make spectral analysis. Only a very few modes of the core space are non-zero in one subdomain, whatever the total number of subdomains. Okay? On each interface, you have only 2 non-zero coarse modes. So the number of non-zero coarse modes within one subdomain is just 2 times the number of interfaces of subdomain, whatever the global number of subdomains. So it means that the computation of performing a block, okay, so this is just a block conjugate gradient. It's the same as a block orthodir. I mean, you have what is the main point? You have to compute. So you have CP. CP is the core space built at iteration P. So from the solution of the local Dirichlet problem, we have hundreds or thousands of candidate search directions. that are split interface by interface and domain by domain. So two vectors per interface. The problem is that first we have to project it, to project these vectors, because we have the projection with Feti. So projection with a rigid body. This is a bad idea. Why? Because even if a vector is non-zero only on one interface, its projection is non-zero everywhere. Yes, but in fact, the correction is obtained by adding G sum times something. And G is also a coarse space. G is a set of local rigid body motions. So the projected CP is CP plus G AP. AP is a dense matrix, but AP is a matrix with dimension is number of coarse space vector times number of rigid body modes. So it is 2000 times 600, and it is a small matrix. Okay? And so to compute AP, you have to solve GTG AP is equal to minus GT CP, but GT and CP are two coarse spaces. I mean, on one interface, you have only very few rigid body that are non-zero, the one of the two neighboring subdomains, and very few coarse space vectors that are non-zero also. So this computation is much less expensive than the number of vectors should say. And the same, we have to compute F times P CP, so this is a big deal, this is a big part, because computing the product by F means solving as many local Neumann problems as right-hand side. So as vectors in PCP. 2000, a little bit too much. But it's not 2000 because FPCP is FCP plus FG AP. So FG, you have computed that at the beginning. FG is coarse also. I mean, when you take a vector that is non-zero, if you take a vector that is non-zero only, for instance, in the first blue interface there, what does it mean? It means that the local Neumann problems are non-zero only in the two neighboring subdomains. And so F times these vectors will be non-zero only on the interfaces of the two subdomains that share the interface on which the initial vector is non-zero. So FC is also a coarse space. FG is also a coarse space, and so on and so forth. And FG can be computed once for all at the beginning. Okay, so this can be computed in parallel, and this is coarse. Okay. It stops being coarse when you re-orthogonalize it using all the previously computed vectors. But basically, it means that also at each iteration, you build hundreds or thousands of search directions. You don't have to compute hundreds of thousands product of this direction by the complete operator F. You look at the local level. At the local level, you just have to solve as many local Neumann problems as 2 times the number of interfaces of the subdomain. So let's say 6, 8, 10. And it's not depending upon the total number of subdomains. Okay, so I'm seriously late, but I think it is the last but one slide. So this is a test case. So my test case, not that big a problem. I mean, it's something like 17 million degrees of freedom. So 100 subdomains, so in a little bit less than 200,000 degrees of freedom per subdomain. And with two kinds of splitting. One I will call checkerboard, so square, clean squares. So the other one is decomposition in slices, so it is the worst in terms of heterogeneity induced by the geometry. And depending upon the orientation of the fibers with the decomposition, the problem is more or less stiff in terms of numerical analysis. Okay, and the Poisson ratio of the polymer matrix is 0.45, that is rather easy, or 0.4999, that is probably insane in this case, with the P1 finite elements. But I mean, just to see how it hurts when you try to hurt, and it hurts a lot. And okay, there are 58 core compute nodes with 4 cores per subdomain. So plenty of results. But what is Okay, let's go to the first line. First row. So it is a checker decomposition with a quasi-incompressible material for the polymer matrix. The FETI converge in this case with a weighting factor. It takes 233 iterations. So it means that the global number, the number of search directions that will be computed is 233 because there is one per iteration. And so the number of solutions within each subdomain is 2 times 233 because at each iteration you solve one Dirichlet problem for the preconditioner, one Neumann problem for the operator. And the elapsed time is 991 seconds. SFETI, 46 iterations. Yes, but at each iteration we have built 100 search directions due to this splitting, this decomposition. So the total number of search directions that is built is 4,600. Much, much, much larger, of course. But the cost in number of local solutions is not so high. Why? Because of the coarseness of the operator. The fact that at each iteration we didn't have to solve 100 Neumann problems. Also, we were building 100 new directions. We just had to solve 8. It is a square, so you have 4 neighbors, 2 vectors per interface, so 8 local Neumann problems. So the total number of local solutions is similar in the case with the FETI method. The cost for reconjugation is much, much higher because it's 4,600 search directions. So at each step, you have many operations for the block reconjugation. Nevertheless, it is much faster. Why is it much faster? Because of the parallel efficiency, the fact that we are performing simultaneous forward-backward substitution and block reverse organization. So in the first row, it is just the improvement is just due to the parallel efficiency improvement. In terms of total cost, it is probably more expensive in terms of total number of arithmetic complexity, but it is much more efficient. Okay. Then you have many cases where the standard FETI method just does not converge. I mean, perhaps it will converge some days, but I was not patient enough to wait for a few days to get the result, so I quit after some time. Okay, but you see that also the method is much more robust. Of course, the worst case is the one when the slicing is made in the bad direction according to the orientation of the stiff fibers with a quasi-incompressible, so it is the third row. Oh no, the second row, excuse me. So 152 iterations. Quickly, the total number of search directions that are built is huge. I mean, it's 20,000. And so what? It's 20,000, but it's just the dimension of the interface. So think again to the figure between what is the size of the interface between the size of the factorized local matrix. You can store vectors before interface vector before it starts hurting in practice. And the number of local solutions is not 15,000; it is just a few hundreds. Okay, so now this is the last slide. So with these multiple search direction approaches, in fact, I presented 2 of them. One based on the fact that we have to solve multi-right-hand side problem, and the other one in which we have to solve only single right-hand side problem, but we create multiple directions due to with the decoupling of the vectors obtained by the Dirichlet preconditioner in FETI. So it's good for both the numerical. What I call the numerical performance, it means the overall arithmetic complexity. I mean, it is less converge faster, or it requires less operation, and furthermore, these operations are more efficiently parallelized on parallel machines that are made of networking compute node themselves being multi-level hierarchical memory, multi-core systems. And the SFETI method is not only better in terms numerical and parallel efficient performance. It's also more robust than FETI for very, very ill condition problem like the one I presented to you. Well, the problem is that for 3D, I mean for 2D, keeping 15,000 interface vector, it's okay. For 3D, it is becoming to be more painful. So we have to work, and we are working on methodology for having a selective approach, not keeping all of them, but only the most efficient part of them, and so on and so forth. So thank you for your attention.